So I want to talk briefly about the evolution of comparative politics, just to give you a background and background to the discipline, which is also in your book, of course. And I'm not going to focus too much on this, but I do want you to have some idea of where we've gone. The study of comparative politics has really changed a lot over time. Historically, there was a largely normative dimension, how politics should be, which was really stressed over empirical ones, which would account for why politics is what it is, which is what we do a lot of today. There are, of course, some exceptions: Aristotle, Machiavelli, who focused on statecraft or how to govern. But largely, it was about normative dimensions, how politics ought to be. Uh, Historically, comparative politics was also largely focused on European states and institutions, parliaments, constitutions. This went on really until the 20th century. After World War II, there were lots of questions. Why did we have fascism, communism, and this sort of increase in comparative politics as a science? Okay, so a much more scientific approach. Comparative politics was and remains partial, though. I mean, if you look at it, you're going to find a lot of the literature that's pro-democracy, sees democracy as the ultimate, because most of the literature is coming out of advanced democracies, right? Out of the United States, Western Europe, in particular. Pro-human rights. So you still have, there's a question of how objective we are today. There are some sort of assumptions that you tend to find. Okay. But we have begun to look much more beyond Europe, to a much more global perspective. With respect to this partiality, there's now a positive belief that political scientist lessons could guide foreign policy. But they do assume that capitalism and democracy are at the peak of the food chain. This is known as modernization theory. Modernization theory, and you should know what this is the idea that as societies develop, they're going to adopt certain traits and move towards capitalist democracy. So modernization theory is historically focused on political institutions, again, parliaments, constitutions, that sort of thing, and the belief that social, economic, and political transformations that happened in Europe from the 17th until the 20th centuries are going to happen everywhere. Okay. But the way this modernization theory has been presented has really changed over time. Before World War II, there was much more of a normative slant. Political science wasn't really science, it was normative arguments. After World War II, you had behavioralism, which really took off. Here, behavioralists focused on political behavior of individuals and also involved a more empirical approach. Okay. Limited to phenomena that are independently observable, quantifiable, and quantifiable can be through qualitative or quantitative data. Okay, but things that you can more touch, empirically measure is a better way to put it. So it's no longer about how leaders should behave by this point, but about what accounts for why they do behave this way. And there's less of a focus at this point on big institutions and much more on the role of individuals, as seen by the ones who create and influence institutions. Right? So this is a transformation. Behavioralism, of course, didn't help us to explain the sudden fall of the Soviet Union. No one predicted that. Or the third wave of democracy, more broadly. So then we moved into an era of post-behavioralism, where you've got mixed methods and a reincorporation of institutions as potential causes and not just the results of politics. So again, bringing institutions back in under behavioralism. The study of institutions is broader now. Organizations or patterns of activity that are self-perpetuating. Okay? These are what we mean by institutions. They serve as the rules, norms, and values that give meaning to human activity. Okay? Institutions are embedded. That means they're difficult to destroy. Okay? This is sort of the quick evolution of comparative politics. Of course, more is in your book. Now, the last thing I want to do in this lecture is talk a little bit about what a state is. We define a state as organizations that maintain a monopoly of violence over a territory. Notice here, organizations, we're talking about structures. Control of violence, we're talking about internal and external forms of violence. And then, of course, the geographic territory, right? So we're talking about specified borders. A state, and this is important, is not a country. See here at the country, it's not a government. Okay, a government are the elites who administer the state. A country is the territory and the people of the state. Okay, so the government is composed of people who come to power and take over the organization that provides mechanisms to rule over a territory. Okay, that would be in the state. The country includes various societal actors and institutions that are not strictly part of the state. Okay, the country includes the nation. Okay, a nation is always thrown together with state, but a nation is not a state. A nation is the people within a state. Okay, so again, ultimately, these terms are used interchangeably colloquially, but there are plenty of reasons why it makes sense to distinguish them. And analytically, we need to. Notice that in your text, they don't always do it, but here's why we should. A state can include one nation if it's an ethnically homogeneous population, or it can be a multinational state. So this is another source of confusion, right? Are we talking about the nation or the state? Is the nation the same as the state? In general, no, it's not. Definitionally, it's not. There may be overlap, okay, in a single nation state, which we'll talk about when we talk about identity. Okay, so that's just important to keep in mind. All these sorts of definitions. And finally, a couple other things. We've got the structures, state, country, all that sort of stuff. But what determines the efficacy of these? Well, legitimacy of those who are governing really does. And this can be based on three different things: traditional legitimacy, charismatic, or rational legal legitimacy. By traditional legitimacy, think about a king. This is the way it's always been done. Okay, you don't obey the king because the king is great. You obey the king because there's a long tradition of that person being obeyed. Okay, charismatic legitimacy is about the appeal of a leader. Okay, we listen to that leader because they are very appealing. The ideas they have are appealing. The way they present them are appealing. Rational legal legitimacy is based on laws and processes that are highly institutionalized. Okay, so here we obey the leader because once elected in a democratic system, they are the leader, period. Okay, so for example, a queen who relies on traditional legitimacy may be looked up to because of that, even though she's a total drunk, right? But by virtue of her crown, robe, and her nice palace, we're going to look up to her. Obama is a great example of someone who came to power as a great orator, right? He was very charismatic. But this would have defined his legitimacy even if he launched a revolution against Bush. Okay? Now, the whole idea that he's president of all of us comes not from his charismatic style, because lots of people don't buy it, but from this rational legal legitimacy. He came to power through an institutionalized process. People cast their votes. There were electoral returns. There was an official ceremony known as the inauguration, and this gave legitimacy to people, to him, from people even who don't like him. Okay, same goes, of course, for any president. So, when we talk about state strength, moving on from legitimacy, you can measure state strength in a number of ways. Okay, the key points here are that you can ensure strong borders. Okay, you have external. You can stave off external threats to your order. Okay, and this can include people, weapons, drugs, information. And the second idea of state strength is based on ensuring control within your borders. So eliminating internal threats to order. Okay, and this can include organizations like the police, the intelligence services like the FBI, taxation powers, okay, without which you lack the means to impose order. Educational system. We'll talk about all these things when we talk about states in the next class. Okay, but just to get this on your mind. And finally, regimes. Okay, regimes are defined as norms and rules regarding individual freedoms and collective equality, the locus of power, and the use of that power. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes. We talk about democracies versus non-democracies, democratic versus non-democratic regimes. Okay, you could talk about liberal versus totalitarian regimes. You could talk about unitary states versus federal structures. So unitary states are those where decision-making is centralized. Federal structures are those where decision-making is devolved to local authorities. In all types, we refer to organizations within the state. Regimes determine the relationship between the component parts of a particular state. Democratic regimes use a variety of institutions to provide for organized input from citizens. Of course, it's a balancing act. Well, you know what? We're going to save this for another time. But we'll talk about executives, legislatives, and judiciaries, and how they differ when we start talking more about the state. So we're going to cut that off here, and you are now done with the first lecture. Congratulations.